Our presenter this morning lives in Milton, Wisconsin, 30 miles from Madison. She grew up in Kelowna, Iowa. Goshen College is one of the schools from which she matriculated, that 50-cent word. She is a retired teacher, professor, whose long-standing interest and passion continues to be in writing. Most recently publishing a 3-part series, Scruples on the Line, a fictional series set during the Civil War. The books reveal authentic voices, giving the reader or listener, they are available in audiobooks too, a fresh look at a familiar story of American history from 1859 to 65. We see those cataclysmic times through the eyes of civilians trapped between obedience to government and historic refusal to participate in war. 5 narrators tell the experiences of Amish, Mennonite, and Old German Baptist communities of conscience. In a book review in Mennonite Quarterly Review, January 23, I wrote, "The narration excels in revealing the inner life of the narrators and those in their circle." 3 historical and 2 imaginative personalities echo through the ages. Today, we hear the words, feel the pulse, and feel the thoughts of Esther Shank in The Sorrows of Esther, a mother during the American Civil War. Esther is a composite fictional character who, with her husband and 5 children, live among other Mennonite families in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. Our presenter is Evie Yoder Miller. Evie will briefly tell how she came to write these volumes and name the other narrators, historical and imaginative figures, and what faith tradition they represent. We're delighted to welcome Evie to our in-person and online class. Evie brought along a few books that may be of interest to some to dig deeper and reflect more. Evie, welcome.
Oh, come on. Oh, thank you very much, John. Let me get this adjusted so I don't have to yell. That looks good. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm very happy to be here with the Sojourners class, and maybe there are some Weavers among us, I'm not sure. So we have a good composite of people here. And I'm pleased to see you and to be able to read from my trilogy about the Civil War. I started research in about 2008. I was still teaching at University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, and I started doing research, went to the Shenandoah Valley, of course, went to the Historical Museum in Kelowna, Iowa, and eventually discovered John Fretz Funk's diaries in the archives here, which were here on campus at that time, from which I learned a lot about Mr. Funk. And I understand that, John, you did a session with this same group about John Funk. And so I wanted to do something different. And because the females in my trilogy are near and dear to me, I chose Esther Shank to read from. So I'm giving you a limited view of what the trilogy is, because there are 5 narrators. And I'll tell you briefly about each of them. You know a little bit about John Funk. You know of his importance to the Mennonite Church. You may not know that he came from Eastern Pennsylvania. And the years that I'm interested in are the war years when he lived in Chicago. He came to Chicago thinking, well, if we have to have a war to settle this treatment of Black people, maybe that's all right. In other words, he was not a terribly devoted pacifist at that point. But during the Chicago years, he developed much more of a conscience about peace and indeed became a spokesperson for peace because he felt that Amish and Mennonites in particular were losing a lot of their tradition of being peaceful people. And that indeed played out during the Civil War. So my books are chronological. They begin in 1859 and go until 1865. I call John Funk Fretz. I was desperate for any name that wasn't John or Jacob. And so I latched on to Fretz very happily. His mother's maiden name was Fretz. And he was called Fretz, as I understand it, when he was in his youth in Eastern Pennsylvania. He came to Chicago to work in a lumber yard with his brother-in-law. He got a degree of sorts in a business college. He was set on that path of being a business person. In the summer of 1863, he published the pamphlet, which was 16 pages, called Warfare, Its Evils, Our Duty. That says a lot about how far John Funk had come by 1863. And he had 1,000 copies printed, if you can imagine that, this little booklet, pamphlet. In late 1863, he published the first issue of Herald der Wahrheit, or Herald of Truth, which we know also its history coming down to Anabaptist world today. So I think it was a 4-page beginning. John M. Brenneman from Elida, Ohio, who maybe more than anyone else was a leader in the Mennonite church at that time. John M. Brenneman contributed many articles to this publication also. So Fretz is one of my favorite 5 narrators. Another favorite is Jacob Schwarzendruber. He's a favorite because he was the first Amish bishop in the Kelowna, Iowa community. And since I'm from Kelowna, there was a special incentive and delight in doing research in Kelowna and learning more about this man who came across as rather cantankerous, very set in his ways, and yet there is a kindness in his spirit also. He really didn't want to be harsh. So that was an interesting characterization to deal with in a novel. Another thing that's really important about these 2 men, John Funk and Jacob Schwarzendruber, is that each of them developed a conscience against the use of substitutes during warfare. In other words, Mennonites and Amish were used to paying money to find someone to fight for them during warfare. This happened in the old country. It happened here in the Revolutionary War, and it was a custom that they were used to. People did not have a conscience against it when the Civil War began. The options for men were to enlist in the North or the South, to pay a commutation fee, to flee, or to hide at home or in some other difficult place to be found, or to buy a substitute. But during the war, both Funk and Schwarzenegger wrote and spoke about their understanding that this was wrong and this practice needed to change. There's one other male narrator, David Bowman. He's from the Shenandoah Valley. He is a fictitious person. I made him up, but he's based on what I learned happened to people living in the Shenandoah Valley. So I created him as a minister in the German Baptist Church at Flat Rock, Virginia. But the things that happened to him, including building an extra closet to be able to hide deserters and slaves. Well, really, the slaves wanted to stay in the horse shed because they said they needed to be alert. But this was a major undertaking that David took on when he realized he had to do more than not go to war. He had to build a closet where he could keep a few people safe. David also had draft age sons who had fled. And so that was a major suffering, I guess we would say, on his part. Okay, now the women. The women are a 40-year-old woman, Esther Shank. She is also fictitious. She also lives in the Shenandoah Valley. I placed her at Dale Enterprise, which is close to Harrisonburg. She's in her 40s and has 5 children when the war starts. During the war, both her husband, Simon, and the oldest son, Andrew, both flee several times. She has a son, Peter, who joins the Confederacy. That was my choice, obviously, because I wanted to get the South's point of view into my novel. And so that was a major impetus for creating Peter. And there are younger children that I will refer to as we go along, as I read from the books. Then I tried something new for myself to challenge myself. I created a child. And I thought, goodness, what would that have been like to have been a child growing up during the Civil War? I placed her in what was Western Virginia at the beginning of the war. And that became the state of West Virginia, I think in 1863. So she was in a situation where there was some traffic and people were coming through. And so I kind of used her also as a way to have some interaction among these different characters who were coming from Pennsylvania. The area she was in was just south of Somerset County, Pennsylvania. In fact, that's where Papa came from. And so her issue is that Mama dies, which is not unusual for mamas to die. And then Papa goes back to Somerset County and finds Mother. And so this is a situation where these children are learning to relate to a new mother figure. My own wishes for this trilogy when I started writing. First of all, I wanted to include more than the Shenandoah Valley. If anyone knows anything about the Civil War and Anabaptists, you know what happened in the valley when Philip Sheridan and his band came up through the valley and the burning campaign occurred in 1864. But I wanted more. I wanted to show that everyone is affected by war. I don't care where you are. I mean, we know that from wars going on in Ukraine. We are affected by it. And I felt the same way about creating characters who also struggle with how to be peaceful during wartime. And so that's why I used Iowa, Chicago, as well as Western Virginia, and the Shenandoah Valley for my characters. Many stories are told about men during the Civil War, as we would expect. And as I indicated already, it was very important to me to have females in the story who had a major role and whose lives were terrifically impacted by having their husbands, sons, brothers leave. And often they took over as the farm managers, as well as the single parents. So, Esther. At the end of the first chapter in book 1, Esther says, this is in 1859, in spite of hate-filled rumors, our family will manage well enough. He tears them out. As long as we keep our health. Mary Grace still fits herself under the wing of my arm, her head on my chest. And Simon is right. A tiny bird in the house is not a thing to be feared. I must trust. When the wind turns blustery and the nights lengthen, we will stay tight together. Our Massanutten Mountain keeps watch. So that's her attitude. She knows what she needs to do. She needs to trust. We would say she puts on a good front in 1859. So for people either in the North or the South during the Civil War, whether they joined the army or avoided it, the war came to them. In the case of Virginia residents, there were military drafts, there were exemptions, there was a frequent practice of annulling the exemption. And so their lives were lived in uncertainty. Would the men be around? How long would they have to be gone from the area to avoid being drafted? There were many shameful acts, as you can imagine, in a war. There were some glorious choices that people made. I tried to create 5 narrators who all struggled with being peaceful people in some way or another. And I think that's one of the secrets to the book, that being peaceful was not easy. And I think that's what you were referring to, John, when you referred to getting inside the hearts and minds of these characters. So for Esther, to look at her sorrows is to look at her struggles. It's to look at the uncertainty, the ridicule, the drafts, the demands for food from soldiers, the worry of having a son in the Confederate Army. All these choices made by others imposed suffering on Esther. What's going to happen? The great unknown of warfare, and I would say of storytelling. What's going to happen? Peter sometimes slips away from camp. He's a Confederate soldier, and he comes home for an overnight when close enough. I'm going to read a conversation from book 2 between Peter and his mother, Esther. So I created this dialogue. Obviously, I did not find instances of mother and son talking together. So this is my imagination. This is the fictional part of historical fiction. When Peter sat again, he took Jephthah. This is a younger son that Simon and Esther have after the war has begun. When Peter sat again, he took Jephthah, put a thick finger inside the baby's fist, and rested his head on the back of Mama's rocker. I miss you, Ma. Everyone, even Pa. Yes, Peter, you too. One side gonna win, the other, he shook his head. We can't lose. We won't stop fighting. We know we're in the right. But Peter, closed my eyes, wiped fingertips across my cheek. It's ungodly. His rocker stopped creaking. One time, Ma, he stopped short. I opened to see him press a fist to his mouth. Jephthah wiggled and Peter grabbed him close. You don't understand, he said softly. Couldn't. But a hardness crept in. Feels good doing as we're told. Animals on the other side. His eyes stayed fixed far away. My boy, sad and angry by turns, a grown man, a full year's beard, his own ways. I'm only a small part, Mom, replaceable. The 52nd, another small part. But when I stand at attention and the colonel walks by, looks me in the eye, it's something. I'm where I'm to be. He closed his eyes and rubbed a sock-covered foot on the rocker rung. Time may be coming. He jerked his head and his voice hushed more. Something, all right, to be a part. I couldn't take my eyes off him. The Army of Northern Virginia, I go where asked. An enemy decides, or an officer. I won't let my brothers down. He leaned forward, made big eyes at Jephthah. No, he couldn't see. Can't. How it is. He slowly rocked again. Not so low as to run. Your brothers are here. No, Ma, I know my brothers. He made a noise that sounded like a sob, but collected himself. I lost one, a brother. All the thousands that died, I lost my closest, Burton. Loved him like a brother. I pressed fingertips to my forehead. I'm sorry. I don't know what you've been through, Peter. What you've chosen. I couldn't cross over, not even if my words had been better. Somebody else's boy. Later, he says, Burton had his banjo in camp. All winter, he taught us songs, kept us going when spirits sang. I reached for Jephthah, but Peter paid no notice. We have revivals, Mom. Ministers come to camp, one church or another, tell us to live righteous lives, not drink so much. They leave tracts or Bibles. And then later, Peter didn't know where they'd be going next. Maybe out west, but another time he said, north, most likely, maybe Stonewall. Could be Lee, marching anywhere, better than stuck in camp all winter. Simon will never go looking for Peter. He showed no dismay at Peter's sudden departure. He's given him up. Nothing like that Hildebrand father keeping track of his Benjamin. Mary Grace couldn't stop her trembling lip. I wish you'd stay the night. I nodded, but I turned from her, my sorrow welling. I could have done better. Could have grabbed the oilcloth from the table and given it to Peter. He gets soaked on wet ground at night. So that's an example of the mother-son relationship. But who else is Esther other than someone who is acted on by her son's choice, join the Confederacy, by the Confederacy itself for insisting on drafts, by her husband's choice to plead? Who else is she? We would talk about the agency today of a person. And Esther does have agency in this book. From history, we know she couldn't vote. She couldn't own property. She had few choices. She was basically stuck there managing the property. We know that her son William in the first book taught her how to sign her name, rather on the sly. When Esther is wondering which general might come next, might go where the next time he brings men to the valley, who gave Esther support? A woman alone with children? Who helped her give care to 2 new babies that came during the Civil War when Simon was at home? In a way, she is a 19th century Job figure, perhaps. And what I just read to you is only in book 2 in 1863. I think in many ways, her personal story is an act of faith to continue on, to follow up from what she said in 1859, that we will be safe because the Massanutten Mountain is there and will protect us. We will do what we can. For another segment, I want to read, this is from book 3, Passages. And whereas book 2 covered the major battles during the Civil War from Antietam to Vicksburg to Gettysburg, now in book 3 we start in February of 1864, when, as I said already, the calamity in the Shenandoah Valley is closer and closer. So, book 3, this is a scene that occurs when soldiers frequently came to their house. Soldiers aren't being fed well. They're hungry. They go to the houses that are available to them. So this is one of the scenes I created for Esther and her daughter Mary Grace and Jephthah in June of 1864. A man stumbled in our house last week like a drunk one, my butcher knife at the ready on the chopping block. I only meant to keep him at bay. Other soldiers shouted outside. Was it so wrong to hide a loaf from my children? How many loaves have I given away plus my man and 3 big boys given one way or another, taken. On the day the soldiers came again, I sent William outside with orders. Give each man 1 loaf to his lonesome. I kept 1 loaf for my children to share. I said to Mary Grace afterwards, I'm not a bad person. I don't want anyone to starve. I said it again. She nodded. Now she reminds me to eat. Our Miriam, 4 months, needs nourishment. She came long before this latest infestation of soldiers. Some days I hardly remember her birth. So much has happened since. The man at our place, ravenous and lacking manners, shouted outside until this wild one staggered in, his eyes glazed. I shook in my bones. What did he intend? The last loaf at the far end of Miriam's cradle, back in the back room, under bedding. Others tell of hiding eggs, too. Smell of bread lingered, but that man wasn't going near my babe. I waved my knife like a sword. No harm, Mary Grace says. I shouted. She kept Jephthah turned away in the back room, tried to make a game of rocking Miriam, 1 hand on the cradle, 1 eye turned back to me. A man outside had yelled for someone to milk the cow. He dragged 1 toward the house, banged with a knife on the bands of the bucket. My tender William put on a brave face, standing at the door, sneezing and stammering. Not time yet. Milk the blame cow, the man roared his bad words. What the devil, youngster? Grab her teats. Something flashed as I heard heavy steps of another on the porch. A second man's body pushed past William inside my head, a whirl between him and the voice outside. William clattered down the steps out of sight. He says he knelt, 1 knee, but could squeeze little more than a cupful. Mary Grace had to wrest the knife away. She wrapped her thin arms around my waist. The man backed out. She talked quietly. They're gone, Mom. I couldn't let go, like a frightened sheep. They're gone, Mom, she said. The shakes came. My grip stayed clenched. I never meant to use. Slowly, she pried the handle from my fingers, said soothingly, It's over, Mom. I didn't know she could muster. Jephthah wrapped his arms and tugged on my leg. I want to read 1 more instance of a soldier and Esther interaction. And remember, these soldiers are hungry. They need whatever they can find. They get very poor food, north or south, if you can call it food. So they came repeatedly to her farm. One time they picked apples and peaches, grapes. Here's another time. Those same men, plus 1 more, came back today. This time they walked right inside, claiming to thank us for the fruit. I picked up and stared from one to the next. Mary Grace scurried to the bedroom with Miriam, but Jephthah had no fear. He ran to the men before I could stop him. Hey there, little feller, The burly man boomed. Saw you the other day. With one quick motion, he gathered Jephthah in his arms and swung him in the air. Miriam came in an instant, but stood back, biting his fingers. Jephthah yelled, "Whee!" Raised his arms to touch the upper beams. He's not had roughhouse since Joseph left. Stop, I said, half stumbling toward my littlest boy. No trouble, lady, the man said, swinging Jephthah away from me. No trouble at all. Jephthah let out another shriek. A man with dark eyes about to pop out of their sockets barred my path. We miss our little fellers at home. His kind voice made me look again. No harm, man, no harm. They passed Jephthah among them. The small man half danced around the kitchen table, swinging Jephthah with a wildness. The boy's bare feet bumped the tops of table chairs and rattled a kettle empty on the hearth. I stood in the corner, clutching my broom. I would have swung and given chase like with bats, if need be. When the last shaggy one took his turn, he sat Jephthah on his shoulders and marched about the table singing, "Oh, we'll rally round the flag, boys. We'll rally once again." Then he headed for the bedroom, but turned back smartly. The others joined in the chorus. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah. Down with the traitors, up with the stars. The man sang yet another verse. Then all of them sang the chorus louder. While we rally round the flag, boys, we rally once again, shouting an ever cry of freedom. At last, the men tired of their cavorting and spoke their farewell, calling Jephthah little man and giving him a swat on the behind. The burly one gave him a big smooch. We fell to sobbing, except for Jephthah. He went to the window and slapped at it as if to call the men back. I made him sit on the wooden box, but he banged his heels and said, "Rah, boys, rah." Jephthah, stop at once, I said. No more singing or banging your feet. Mary Grace came with Miriam. Did they mean us? Mary Grace asked. That ugly word. Peter, William said quietly. They don't know who or what, I said. They only sing their song. It makes them feel strong. But we're not traitors, not theirs, Mary Grace said. I don't care. Peter's my brother, William said. He's our boy, I said. But those would see him otherwise if they knew. Not an enemy, Mary Grace said. Not Peter. Never, I said, hugging her to me, squishing Miriam. Blood runs deep, but war takes sides, tries to label who's for, who's against, as if simple. They thought us south, but no better for us to be north, the way they see it if we don't take up rifles. Rah, rah, Jephthah said quietly. I picked him up and sat him on my lap. Only words and a tune for you, I said. But listen, I swiveled his chin so he had to look at me. We don't sing that song. Not you, not ever. I looked to my older ones. No one's innocent. your brothers, none of us, not the noisy men either, all of us, someone's enemy. But remember, family's stronger. It feels bad, William said. Men in blue. Hard to feel good, Mary Grace said. But Jephthah didn't know, did you, buddy? She reached to tap him on the head, blew him a kiss. So those are 3 samples of Esther's experiences and her sorrows. And just as the war labels some people as friend and others as enemy, as if it's all clear-cut, so I think we can't easily label actions of common citizens as either passive or aggressive, helpful or harmful. In the moment, we all do what comes easily most of the time. Or we do it with a lot of hesitation and don't know what we're doing. Whether we feel squeezed into a corner or suddenly bold in our own agency for ourselves and others. But our identity is always fluid depending on who's looking at us, whether we're an enemy or a friend or family. We have choices, whether we sing the Union song or not. There's much in this story of the Civil War and Anabaptists that affected me, and I created these characters to attempt to show the impact emotionally and intellectually, spiritually on Anabaptists living through the Civil War, no matter where they were. So that is what I wanted to read for you today. I don't know, John, do we have 5 minutes? Okay, I'm sorry there isn't more time for questions, but if some of you have a question or two that you really need to ask, please do so. And I suppose we might need to give the microphone if someone does, so that people can hear.
Or you could repeat the question. If you would repeat the question.
Anyone have a question? How many of you have heard stories about the Civil War passed down from grandparents? Your grandparent, from a great-grandparent? Yes, I see some hands. Anything you want to share about that or comment on?
It's got to do with food. You asked me for loaves of bread. And I had an ancestor who gave to both sides.
Thank you. Vic says he has an ancestor who gave food to both sides during the Civil War. And certainly Esther would have given to Confederate soldiers as well as to the Union examples that I read. Is there anyone else with a question or a comment?
Well, a word of affirmation for what you've done. The juxtaposing of positions and how hard it is to know, but I think it's through hearing such stories or reading such stories that I don't know a better way to strengthen our current peace witness. The struggles people have, no different than the ones today. but the persistence comes through.
Thank you. If some of you couldn't hear, she gave an affirmation for reading stories about hard situations. That's one way that we learn also how to respond, what to say in a very difficult situation that we also face. We need to know, not shy away from the hard stuff. That would be my position also. Thank you. Okay, Winifred.
How do you form these stories in your mind? And then did you think you would write 5 books? I mean, the series, I mean.
I didn't know how long the books would be. I just wrote, at first I picked out the key situations in the war itself that involved Anabaptists, or that Fritz Funk would have known about because he was a reader himself of newspapers. So I picked out those situations, then I figured out who are my characters, who's going to respond in what way to these situations. And then I wrote and created scenes that fit with what I had learned historically. Okay. Thank you all very much. You've been a wonderful audience, and it was a pleasure to meet you.